So, welcome to our October colloquium with Dr. Jan Lüdert. He's the head of programs at the German Center for Research and Innovation in New York. And today he'll provide a practitioner's perspective on the evolving field of science and knowledge diplomacy. He'll discuss the historical and political context of establishing the global network of German Centers for Research and Innovation, the importance of science and knowledge diplomacy for academic freedom and exchange, and he would also highlight the work of the German Center for Research and Innovation in New York. He will also touch on the importance of fostering science and knowledge diplomacy in the current context of the liberal order, academic freedom, and science skepticism. A brief background on Dr. Lüdert: he earned his PhD in political science from the University of British Columbia. He holds a Harvard Kennedy School Public Leadership credential, a first-class honors master's in international relations from the Australian National University, and a bachelor's in public policy from Hamburg University for Economics and Politics. If you want to learn more, you can also visit our website where you can find more information on his work. Now, let's begin. Dr. Lüdert, please, you can start.
Thank you, Paulina. Thank you, Bernhard, for the invitation and for opening up the space. Transatlantic relations in the making. It is with great pleasure that I can present to you today. I'm going to jump right in. We have a small group, so I'm looking forward to questions. As Paulina said, I want to talk about the practice of transatlantic science and knowledge diplomacy today, and in the case of my practitioner's perspective on the German Centers for Research and Innovation. As Paulina also outlined, I'll give a brief overview of the historical and political context of establishing the DWIH, das Deutsche Wissenschafts- und Innovationshaus, by discussing normative and practical importance of science and knowledge diplomacy for establishing academic freedom and the exchange between researchers, policymakers, and industry, because that is the core mission of the DWIH. And thirdly, I really want to touch a little bit on our day-to-day work and what we do, and that's certainly something we can also talk a little bit more during the Q&A. But I want to synthesize my seminar, my talk today, by offering a deeper understanding on the importance of fostering science and knowledge diplomacy as it relates to, I think, very apropos contestations to the liberal order, academic freedom, and science skepticism, which I think we all see being on the rise. The German Centers for Research and Innovation had the impetus for fostering mutual understanding through academic exchange and international education and concepts of foreign cultural and educational policy that date back more than a century. I think many of you know the German Academic Exchange Service, the DAAD, or here in the United States, the IEE, the International Education Association. They are in many ways the forerunners of the DWIHs themselves. The process of establishing the DWIH network itself dates back to 2008, when Germany's federal government strategy for internationalizing education, science, and research stressed that a science policy with an increasingly international focus should include a concerted effort to represent Germany in its diverse research and innovation landscape worldwide. And building up on the Research and Academic Relations Policy Initiative, Germany's Foreign Service established die Deutschen Wissenschafts- und Innovationshäuser as part of its overall policy framework in 2009. Since then, 5 centers have opened throughout the world, across various continents. In North America, we have the offices here in New York, as well as in South America with Sao Paulo, Brazil, Asia, in New Delhi, India, and in Tokyo, Japan, as well as an office in Moscow, Russia. The Moscow office is still open. We can certainly talk a little bit more about that as well. But as you can imagine, this office is under a lot of duress and is in more or less in a state of hiatus. In 2022, a 6th location opened in San Francisco here in the United States. That has a lot to do with the focus on technology and deep tech and the sheer size of the US economy, because the New York Center alone cannot stem the demands that we have. Institutional funding for the DWIH network has been granted through Germany's foreign federal office since 2017, while the German Academic Exchange Service centrally coordinates the DWIH network from Bonn, Germany. I think here it is important to realize, and research has shown this, that the Foreign Office regularly outsources its administrative and implementation functions to intermediary organizations like the DAAD, who in our case acts as a quasi policymaker, and especially in the fields of science and knowledge diplomacy. This later point is especially important insofar as the DAAD formulates science and knowledge diplomacy policy, which we here in the DWIH through our network informs and acts and fosters. The uniqueness of the DWIH network with respect to science and knowledge diplomacy here is well summarized, because we have this sort of eye-level exchange between researchers, policymakers, and industry, as well as civil society. And that, of course, is extremely valuable on the one side on the international level. But in contrast to traditional science and technology offices at embassies or consulates or international chambers of commerce or the like, the DWIH are run as independent agencies and coordinated by a trusted international actor like the DAAD. We can therefore create, if you will, safe spaces in which different national and sectoral actors can come together and create jointly and identify issues, discuss opportunities and challenges across science and diplomatic areas. And this, I think, is one of the very unique points about science diplomacy and the community in which we find ourselves. Substantively, then, the DWIH, through our activities, act as a global representation for institutions, including the Alliance of Science Organizations in Germany, the Federation of German Industry, BDI, as well as the Association of German Chambers of Commerce and Industry. Besides these, the Federal Ministry of Education and Research and the Federal Ministry for Economic Affairs and Climate Action are also represented on the Board of Trustees of the DWIH network. I now want to kind of briefly touch on two phases in the genesis and evolution of the DWIH network. During the first decade of the DWIH network, we had two distinguishable moments. In the establishment phase, beginning in 2008, norm entrepreneurs and key policy decision makers and institutions inspired by similar developments in other countries, I think some of you may know Swissnex in Switzerland, triggered the formation of the DWIH network. The FFO engaged science and research institutions with the stated goal to develop the DWIH, and at this early juncture, the institutions sought to find common ground on the one hand, the utility and necessity of forming a DWIH network, as well as addressing potential loss of visibility in host countries or subsumation of existing purviews by these existing institutions. I'm thinking in particular of the DFG, German Research Foundation, the DAAD with its very wide and deep international network. However, by 2015, towards the end of this phase, we could see a gradual institutionalization of the DWIH and a notable science diplomacy instrument with agency to promote national higher education research and innovation systems in a holistic way was set in place. The second phase, the consolidation phase, began in 2016, so about 7 years ago, where the Foreign Office reiterated its objective to foster a network knowledge society, especially by showcasing Germany as a strong research and innovation country. And yet, the effectiveness and legitimacy of the DWIH was at this point scrutinized by the Federal Audit Office, or Bundesrechnungshof, and following an evaluation, two necessary adaptations for the DWIH network were identified. On the one hand, it was about centralizing the coordination of the global DWIH network to enhance its efficiency and pooling effects. And on the other, it was suggested to implement a revision of funding structures from annual program funding to institutional funding. As you can imagine, that is especially important in this moment in time, because last year many institutions had severe budget constraints, and so having institutional funding in place is very critical for our future and for our work. In sum, the DWIH network first emerged and became institutionalized in response to a combination of norm entrepreneurs who engaged in what I have called elsewhere structure making, by proposing novel global venues for the advancement of Germany's science and knowledge diplomacy, and which aligned with the strategic interest of governmental research and industry organizations to foster Germany abroad. In fact, the overarching aims of the DWIH network are to increase the visibility of Germany, of German innovation leaders around the world, to raise awareness of the German science, research, and innovation landscape, and to advise scientists in Germany and the host countries by connecting actors at the local level, here in our case in the East Coast and New York. To put differently, the DWIH networks are intended to sharpen the visibility of German innovation leaders abroad via a joint platform for research organizations and research-based companies. The DWIH fosters this type of bridge-building activity by working with a very wide range of actors in science and business from Germany and those active in host countries. These include universities and non-university research institutions such as Fraunhofer, Leibniz, Helmholtz, intermediate and funding organizations like the DFG and the DAAD, as well as research-based companies, including startups and others. Such a wide as well as deep network of actors establishes valuable transnational multipliers, which we consciously connect across different sectors. So science, industry, and policy are our sort of trifecta that we of actors that we're working with. The DWIH network here in New York itself was founded in 2010, and we're very lucky because we are housed in the German General Consulate building here in New York, right across from the United Nations, together with a number of university liaison offices like the University of Heidelberg, University of Cologne, Campus OWL, Ostwestfalen-Lippe, but also the UAS7 network, which is the network of 7 universities of applied sciences, UR-Ruhr Alliance, as well as the DFG also has a satellite office here while they're having their main presence in Washington, D.C. I just outlined sort of this network idea behind the DWIH. We have a supporter network, which is comprised of 2 types of supporters. On the one hand, we have main supporters. Those are organizations and institutions with a physical presence here in the US, and associate supporters, which are universities or science organizations who do not have an office, but work with us from Germany. We meet biannually. We have advisory council meetings in which our supporter network helps us strategize and chart a course forward. And we're structurally organized as a sort of deliberative body between our supporters. So the decisions in our supporter networks are based on sort of a participatory process. Currently, we have 25 members. I just mentioned a few. In addition to that, we also have the German Historical Institute in Washington as part of our network, the Hasso-Plattner Institute, who is also here in New York, but a number of other universities, including Freie University of Berlin, the TUM is part of our network, Max Planck, and others. I'm going to jump ahead a little bit in the spirit of time and talk now about science and knowledge diplomacy at the DWIH New York. And so first of all, science diplomacy, as I understand it, or we understand it, describes the foreign science policy pursued by government and scientific actors. Science diplomacy in a broad sense, of course, also includes international scientific transfer and exchange activities, considering their political and socially relevant effects. And that's exactly sort of where we're situated. In German, the term Außenwissenschaftsdiplomatie is, of course, equally common, but in practice, we typically commonly use the English version. Science diplomacy is particularly suitable for our discussion of transdisciplinary and is in our case transatlantic exchange between the US and Germany. Knowledge diplomacy, on the other hand, is an overlapping, yet in my view, distinct approach focused on the role of international higher education, research, and innovation in deepening relations among states and addressing a wide range of global challenges. I think many of you probably know the useful tripartite taxonomy that the Royal Society and the American Association for the Advancement of Science has put together by defining science diplomacy first as science in diplomacy, where science provides know-how, facts, or models on which diplomacy is built, or from which foreign policy goals can be distilled. I'm always thinking back of this positive case of closing the ozone layer, that was very much driven by science, and policy could enact meaningful change. But of course, other climate change and other ideas are also seen in this vein. Secondly, it's diplomacy for science. That is, international scientific freedom and cooperation is supported and promoted through diplomatic channels. And this, of course, is especially critical in relations to the free exercise of science and where that is suppressed. Here we can also think of initiatives like the Academy in Exile. We're just working with them as well, or Scholars at Risk, where it's also about really providing a cooperative environment and a supportive environment for science to flourish. And thirdly, science for diplomacy. And this is research and teaching themselves become instruments of diplomacy by supporting or enabling international relations through cooperation and exchange. Indeed, science diplomacy as practiced by us here in New York declares as an objective pursuing also multilateral interests through scientific exchange and cooperation. We just had activities at the United Nations with the United Nations Academic Impact about integrating the SDGs into science and curricula, and invited a number of universities to this type of work. In other words, science and knowledge diplomacy for us are not mutually exclusive, but best understood as complementary in our work. And what is more, and I think this is quite critical, that they are value-based by facilitating science and diplomatic relations concurrently, under sort of values of academic freedom, of the free exchange of knowledge, etc. And preparing and facilitating multilateral, transatlantic, and interdisciplinary solutions to global challenges continues to be very central to our work. Now, what I've just outlined is the sort of science and knowledge diplomacy as a soft power approach. Now, I think we're all quite aware that the extension of soft power, however, is only part of the picture. Since 2020, in a strategy paper for Germany's science diplomacy, the Foreign Office identified various threats to science and society. I think that describing them as phenomena of shrinking spaces, in which we sort of see that this sort of more soft power approach to science diplomacy is no longer fully applicable, and we need to also take a more real political view on science diplomacy. And in response, the DAAD has developed a new definition of science diplomacy, if you will, in a multipolar world. Of course, issues like COVID-19, global health governance, or more recently, technological transformations in the age of AI are all good examples of why we need to adjust this. And I think this is worth noting in full. This new sort of definition is considered as follows. Science diplomacy must acknowledge the challenges imposed on it by non-scientific power political considerations. A new science diplomacy in this sense contributes to civil society dialogue, to sustainable development of society and economy, and to the redemption of, in our case, German interests. It aligns these goals differently from region to region and weighs the opportunities and risks of international cooperations against each other. In an increasingly disorderly multipolar world, it contributes to the negotiation and implementation of multilateral partnerships. In short, science diplomacy is not just about the free exchange of knowledge, but it also must be viewed in power political issues and real political settings. I think you all are aware of Germany's national strategy with China, where China is described as a partner, a rival, and a competitor. Now, what do you do with that when another nation is all of those things at the same time, and how do we engage in science diplomacy in such an environment? So how do we, just to illustrate a couple of examples, what do we do? What is our praxis here in New York? And then I'll stop in a minute or two. I think a great example is our flagship program, which starts actually in 10 days from now. That's our Future Forum, this year titled From Crisis to Resilience. It happens here in New York. We invite a number of speakers from both the US and Germany to speak and to engage in an interdisciplinary discussion about the question of resilience through the lens of engineering, cyber and tech, through the lens of sociological approaches. We have psychologists here. We have people who work on disaster and risk management. We have folks from the United Nations University in Bonn who will present on the interconnected risk report. And in combination, out of this discussion, we seek to formulate sort of common ground, blue papers, white papers, who can be used as sort of translation tools as it relates to, in our case, the theme of resilience, which is our annual theme this year. The Future Forum in the past few years had different working titles. So in 2008, we had worked on artificial intelligence. In 2020, cities and climate. 2021, societies and transitions, effects of the pandemic. Seems so long ago. 2022, sustainable innovations with a focus on the fashion industry, and it was titled Fabricating the Future. And then this year, our topic is resilience in society. Now, I want to conclude. There's, of course, I think this year we've so far had about 30 activities with over 2,000 participants. I regularly travel to Boston, to Washington. I was just in Chicago at the University of Chicago and in Indiana at Purdue University. Once a year, I travel to Austin to the South by Southwest conference that some of you may know. And those are all sort of our stomping grounds for our work. But let me conclude by saying a few things about the sort of synthesis statement that I had discussed earlier in relation to science skepticism and so forth. Let me just go to my last slide here. So by situating and merging the discussion, our discussion on science and knowledge diplomacy in the case of the DWIH network, I think it is clear that science is a central part of modern society and international relations. However, the historical authority of science, its epistemic communities, and situated in higher education, industry, and policy are no longer taken for granted and imbued with the type of public trust that they once were. Systemic and unwarranted rejection of science, that is science skepticism, has become a major societal problem that poses a threat to the very fabric of liberal democracies and a value-based global order. In an environment where notions of objectivity, of free expression of science, of facts, and of evidence are being undermined or in some instances ignored, the relevance of science and knowledge diplomacy is simply not a trivial matter. On the contrary, academic freedom and scientific exchange requires an environment in which free speech must find common ground for critical, interdisciplinary, and intersectoral engagement, instead of being delimited by skeptics and a mistrust of evidence-based research. It is here that we play a facilitative role in a foremost transatlantic context. We bring together researchers, the public, and other stakeholders, including industry and policymakers from Germany and the US, to establish a basis for consensus by sharing cutting-edge scientific findings and by fostering a mindset for collaboration through innovation. Taking a stand on what is true and objective is and remains the essence of our work. As an institution, we seek to build trust by bringing together actors and perspectives and understand through our activities not only areas of divergence that can be bridged, but more importantly, that convergences as well as synergies become established across the Atlantic. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Lüdert, for the valuable information and also for participating today. And now I look forward to the discussion. So if you have any questions or comments, raise your hands and I'll call on you.